I've been sitting on this topic for a long time, ever since way back last October when I first entertained the notion of introducing more in-depth video essays to the site. Originally, this was going to be my first full-length in-depth video essay, but as I continued revisiting and rewriting the script, I found that my mind would just kind of go off on several different tangents and the script itself would become too big or too unwieldy. So I had to take my time. I had to kind of put it on the back burner while I went to other videos or other projects. And I feel in its current form, I'm able to hone my focus down to a very specific theme that I can tie not just to my own personal journey, but with regards to the historical and contextual usage of the location and the film in question. So I hope you enjoy this because it has been more than a year in the making. Let's proceed.
Last September, I was fortunate enough to take a week-long family trip to Venice, Italy during their Regata Storica event that closes out the city's season of Venetian-style competitive rowing.
And yes, along with being a video essay, this is also an excuse to show off some vacation footage.
I'd visited Europe in the past as a child and adolescent, visits that also included other Italian locales, but this was my first time experiencing not just this specific city, but taking in the Italian culture as a mature adult and becoming enthralled with the whole aesthetic of art, architecture, and customs ranging from the rustic to the celebratory to the decadent. The added bonus of being able to take up a temporary residence in the city, rather than having to ferry or shuttle myself in daily, further enhanced the unique quality of peaceful isolation I felt amidst the multiple canals and bridges, and lent even more credence to one of Venice's venerated nicknames, the Floating City.
But enough of my faux Hemingway-ish tangents. I came to Venice not just for a vacation, but a mission.
Venice has always been connected with filmmaking to some degree or another since the art form's rise to prominence. The city is home to the oldest and most prestigious film festival in the world, and has played host to a plethora of movies and productions throughout the history of cinema. Katharine Hepburn took in the piazza's ambiance in 1955's Summertime, as well as succumbing to a comedic pratfall in the canal. The city's foggy banks greet us in the 1971 Italian-French drama film called Death in Venice, which has one of the most captivating openings comprised of haunting visuals and an emotional swell of a soundtrack.
And from there, let's just say the film ventures into some very problematic territory with regards to the subject matter. Great opening though.
Venice is, of course, the setting of William Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, which in 2004 was made into a feature film starring Al Pacino as the moneylender Shylock and Jeremy Irons as the titular merchant Antonio that owes him a pound of flesh.
Hat that a Jew eyes? Hat that a Jew hands? Organs? Dimensions?
The Venetian canals supported the elaborate opening heist scene of the 2003 remake of The Italian Job. I'll see you again soon and much younger Mr. Sutherland. It's the city that James Bond and Vesper Lynd abscond to in Casino Royale and live happily ever after with nothing terrible ever happening to either of them ever again. Even as recently as this year, Spider-Man Far From Home brought Marvelized action to Venice. Or at least a close green screen approximation of Venice.
Yes, when it comes to filmmakers and their affinity for utilizing this city in all of their projects, I believe a famous archaeologist once said,
Venice.
But while many audiences might recognize this location for thrilling, exciting chases across the canals or romantic interludes, and it's serving as the backdrop, I instead chose to focus on a far, let's say, darker theme.
1973's Don't Look Now is something of a psychological horror thriller combined with a very grounded human drama. The film is adapted from a 1971 short story by Daphne du Maurier and directed by the late Nicolas Roeg. To give you a bite-sized and spoiler-free summary of the movie, a married couple, Laura and John Baxter, portrayed by Julie Christie, and hi again Donald Sutherland, experience the sudden and tragic accidental death of their young daughter. Grief-stricken, they travel to Venice, where John has accepted a commission to restore a decrepit church. The film then soon reveals other aspects involving the paranormal, premonitions, and murder, all the while still expertly conveying the anguish and loss that our couple is still reeling from.
I first saw this movie back in high school, and it not only introduced me to the works of Nicolas Roeg, but also introduced me to the concept of a slow burn atmospheric horror movie.
There is a lot to be said regarding the acting, the editing tactics utilized to alter or distort our perception of time in the movie, the symbolism of the color red, the complicated hearsay history behind the film's infamous sex scene.
It is a film with so much information and elements jam-packed into it that I could ruminate over and analyze, that as I stated before, I had to whittle it down to one specific element. That is the utilization of the Venetian locations to represent the thematic elements of grief and loss that permeate the entire narrative. So, as was mentioned, what precipitates the moving of the couple to Venice is the death of their child. But it is the nature of her death that makes this choice of location pretty haunting from the get-go.
Laura and John's daughter accidentally drowns in a pond by their country home. Once they travel to Venice, Roeg amplifies the thematic element of water as an emotional and symbolic trigger. Whether it's portraying the subplot of a local serial killer's victims being dredged up from the canals, or fleeting glimpses of reflections in the water, it feels as though the film is full-on addressing the inherent discord of someone who is grieving, specifically John, purposefully surrounding themselves with this element as some subconscious form of denial, blocking out the trauma by forcing themselves to interact with the very substance that initiated it. It always struck me as an interesting in-universe choice for this couple to take their work to this city, of all cities.
Now, granted, weather and environmentally speaking, my visit to Venice was far sunnier compared to that of the Baxters.
The film is a thoroughly dreary-looking meditation from start to finish. In many ways, I feel it stands diametrically opposite of Roeg's survivalist tale from 2 years prior called Walkabout. The arid outback desert scenery of that movie serves as a natural visual companion and progression into Don't Look Now. If Walkabout is about confronting and accepting the concept of death in all its extremes, then Don't Look Now explores the gloomy aftermath of the grief and mourning that follows. And nowhere can that be displayed more prominently than by losing yourself in the hypnotic ebb and flow of the Venetian canals.
But the incorporation of water as a thematic element is only part of Venice's storytelling role. The rest, so to speak, is set in stone. Like any long-standing European city, Venice has endured through wars, plagues, political and socio-economical upheavals, and most importantly, environmental shifts. And it certainly shows in the architecture.
Factor in the city's subsidence, or gradual sinking, brought on by both the natural course of time and the increased pollution and eco-disruption due to heavy tourism and cruise ships, and a history of steadfast resilience against the inevitable decay reveals itself. Venice, as a city, is in a constant state of physical degradation.
And ultimately, isn't that what's at the core for some when it comes to recent grief and mourning? A need to kind of persevere or maintain your resolute, kind of stoic nature while it feels like the rest of the world is crumbling around you?
Consider the role John Baxter places upon himself in Venice. It's one of restoration. Not only does the decrepit church provide the setting for a harrowing set piece, but it also represents the state of John's psyche through a majority of the film. One of disrepair, of decay, and barely being maintained. Meanwhile, despite the gaunt and haunting backgrounds, Julie begins to thrive due in no small part to the seemingly paranormal encounters that she finds herself facing. It's a fascinating shift represented not just in the actors' performances, but in the vibrant yet dilapidated structures that loom large throughout the film with their contrasting natures.
And it's this compilation of architecture upon architecture that is kind of the final integral part of the character of Venice.
This is an extremely claustrophobic film. Ironically, the only time it feels as though the settings are more open is when the characters occupy the interiors of buildings. And this is in no way a slant against the setup of the city. During the day, it's a bustling metropolis, perhaps even a little too bustling for its own good. But all that changes dramatically with dusk.
A lot of tourists and even Venetian citizens end up taxiing out of the main hub of the city after the workday's done. Aside from a couple of more palatial landmarks such as the St. Mark's Basilica or the Piazza San Marco, you're left with a very closed-in sestieri or neighborhoods built up more of buildings, bridges, and canals that are seemingly self-contained. Think of it as your own Venetian playground. Sounds pretty good, right? Not so much once nightfall descends.
If there's one aspect Rogue's direction gets pitch perfect, it's the unbelievably isolating feeling you have wandering the streets at night. Darkened corridors, narrow alleys, small cobblestone squares. All of it compacted so close together that it's too easy to be turned around. Compound that with the delusions, grief, and dread that our main characters experience, and Don't Look Now serves up some of the most striking atmospheric horror that modern fare still can't compete with. Anyone can be momentarily startled with a jump scare. Try slowly venturing alone down a darkened pathway with uncertain twists and turns, while the walls of an ancient city close in and every hair on the back of your neck stands at attention. As culturally enriching as Venetian life during the day was for me, nothing came close to the feeling of loneliness I felt traversing in the footsteps of Donald Sutherland's John Baxter, chasing phantoms through the crooked walkways of the city of grief.
Despite trying to keep as many details and spoilerific moments as vague as possible, I still highly recommend Don't Look Now. It displays a master filmmaker at his peak, utilizing not just his craft behind the camera, but the location itself with so much character and vibrancy that it's able to communicate these themes of grief, loss, and mourning so effectively in just the atmosphere presented on the screen. It's hypnotic and horrifying all at once. To be able to personally traverse that territory on my own, to be able to witness and view for myself those canals and that decrepit architecture that I feel only enriches not just the city of Venice, but the stories that storytellers continue to explore through that location. Whether it's books, television, film, art, there's something to these locations and something to these cities that are able to inspire explorations on several different emotions and elements, such as grief.